You people can't even fucking breathe on these cars, let alone touch them.
This is completely unacceptable. Do you
The
understand
words,
me?
crude and sharp,
Oh, honestly.
sliced through the perfumed air of the Genesis luxury showroom, landing like a punch to the gut. They weren't a careless slip. They were a declaration of war, delivered with the smug finality of a king in his castle, loud enough for every champagne-sipping guest and every chrome-polishing salesman to hear. The man who spat them out was Marcus Thorne, the showroom's director. He stood there, a monument to cheap arrogance in a $1,000 suit, arms folded across his chest like a bouncer guarding the gates of heaven. His tone was a hammer, and he was looking for a nail. He found one. Standing in the center of the polished marble floor, bathed in the soft glow of the chandeliers, was a black woman. Her name was Evelyn Reed. She wore a simple, elegant dress the color of autumn embers, her hair swept up, revealing a neck as graceful as a swan's. Her stance was rooted, her eyes as calm and deep as a forest lake. She carried no flashy designer handbag, wore no glittering diamonds, just a small, unassuming leather satchel and a sleek black tablet tucked under her arm. To Marcus, she was a weed in his perfectly manicured garden. To everyone else, she was a customer who had just been publicly crucified. But what no one in that room could possibly comprehend was that Evelyn Reed was more than a customer. She was the architect of their future, the silent hand that could sign off on their biggest contracts, the very woman who held the fate of their entire dealership network in her palm. Before we dive deeper into this powder keg, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? Go ahead and drop your city, your state, your country in the comments down below. And if you believe that human dignity is non-negotiable, that justice should be swift and absolute, then smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell stories here, we start fires. And we're damn glad to have you with us. Now, back to the showroom. Marcus Thorne's smirk stretched across his face, a predatory grin that reveled in the suffocating silence he had created. "These machines," he said, gesturing with a dismissive wave at a row of gleaming G90s, "are not for window shoppers. They are for buyers, real buyers." The disdain in his voice was so thick you could taste it. A few of the guests, uncomfortable but spineless, let out nervous chuckles. One man, older and dressed in a tailored tweed jacket, shook his head slowly, muttering, "Absolutely disgraceful." Behind the reception desk, a young assistant named Sarah froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and outrage, darted between Marcus and Evelyn. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, but her conscience was screaming. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer a single word in her own defense. Her hand rested gently on her tablet, her gaze locked on the man who was, at that very moment, gleefully authoring his own professional obituary. Silence wasn't her shield. It was her sword. She had learned its power years ago, as a young woman fresh out of business school, when a condescending bank manager had told her that her business plan was a cute little dream. He had looked at her, a young black woman with fire in her eyes, and seen nothing but a liability. She had walked out of that office without a word and built a billion-dollar empire from the ashes of his prejudice. She had learned it again when a rival CEO had tried to intimidate her in a boardroom, his voice a booming, arrogant thunder. She had met his storm with a quiet, unnerving calm, and watched him unravel under the weight of his own bluster. She had seen this play 100 times, and she had rewritten the ending every single time. From a shadowed corner near a majestic GV80, a teenager, all sharp angles and righteous fury, raised his smartphone. A small red light blinked to life, a silent witness capturing every vile word, every smug expression. Another guest, a woman in a chic navy blue coat, whispered to her husband, "This is appalling. But they remained frozen, spectators in a coliseum, unsure if they should step into the ring. The air, once filled with the smooth, sophisticated notes of a jazz trio and the intoxicating scent of new leather, now crackled with a different energy. It was the charged, electric tension of an insult so profound, so public, that it could not be ignored. Marcus, drunk on his own perceived power, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, but the venom was more concentrated. If you want to take pictures for your little blog, I suggest you go to the Public Auto Show. In here we deal in serious currency. His eyes raked over her dress, lingered for a moment on her simple, elegant shoes, and then met her gaze again, his expression a final, damning verdict. You are not worthy. A wave of palpable unease washed over the showroom. The assistant, Sarah, pressed her lips into a thin, white line, the muscles in her jaw twitching. She knew what was happening was a violation of everything the company supposedly stood for, but she had a family to feed, rent to pay. She had seen what happened to employees who challenged Marcus. Still, her soul rebelled. But Evelyn Reed, the woman in the burnt orange dress, remained silent. She subtly adjusted the strap of her satchel, letting the room simmer in its own toxic arrogance. To the director, she was an insect to be swatted away. To the growing crowd of onlookers, she was a mystery, a question mark hanging in the air. But to herself, she was exactly what she had always been. The calm before the storm. Patient, inevitable, and about to strike with the force of a hurricane. She had entered the showroom 20 minutes earlier with no fanfare, no blaring trumpets to announce her arrival. No chauffeur in a crisp uniform had held the door for her. No fawning entourage had trailed in her wake. She had come alone, her sensible heels clicking against the Italian marble with a quiet, unshakable confidence. The dress she wore was a deliberate choice. Not flamboyant enough to scream for attention, but not so muted as to fade into the background. It was the color of a slow-burning fire, a quiet inferno, a presence that needed no introduction. The showroom itself was a temple to automotive perfection. Gleaming chrome reflected the thousand-faceted crystals of the chandeliers. The sensuous curves of the vehicles were polished to a mirror shine. The guests, a collection of the city's elite in bespoke suits and designer dresses, drifted from one masterpiece to another, their conversations a low murmur of horsepower, torque, and exclusive waiting lists that stretched into the next year. For them, this was a playground. For Evelyn, it was a battlefield. She had approached the main reception desk with a grace and purpose that should have been the first warning sign. Marcus was already there, holding court, his back to the entrance. He looked irritated by her approach, as if her mere presence was an unwelcome interruption to his evening's performance. Two of his top salesmen flanked him, a matched set of sycophants. One, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and a predatory smile, had a name tag that read, Greg. The other, a younger woman with eyeliner as sharp as her tongue, was named Tiffany. They didn't greet her. They didn't ask if she needed help. They simply performed a silent, swift, and brutal calculation based on her race, her gender, and her lack of ostentatious wealth. The verdict was unanimous. She didn't belong. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was as smooth and cool as polished stone. I'm here to finalize the new fleet package. She placed her tablet gently on the polished granite countertop, her eyes never leaving Marcus's. A soft, unkind laugh escaped his lips. Fleet package? He scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. My dear, those aren't for public consumption. Those are multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. Perhaps you meant to ask for a brochure. He tapped a glossy booklet on the counter with a manicured finger, as if to guide a lost child. Greg and Tiffany exchanged a knowing glance. Greg leaned towards Tiffany and whispered, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "She probably just wants a selfie for her Instagram." The words were tiny daggers, meant to wound, to diminish her, to reduce her to a common clout chaser. Evelyn offered no reply. She didn't need to. Her silence was a pressure cooker, the pressure building with every passing second. At her small desk in the corner, Sarah glanced up again, her face a mask of anxious uncertainty. She had seen Marcus be dismissive before, but this was a new level of cruelty, a public execution. Marcus folded his arms, puffing out his chest, the self-proclaimed king of this small, shiny kingdom. "Let me be blunt," he said, his voice hardening. "These deals, these cars, they're not for people who just wander in off the street. This is a house of luxury. We deal with real corporations, real money, not—" He let the word hang in the air, unfinished, but his sneer filled in the blank with 1,000 ugly assumptions. A few feet away, a couple who had been admiring the supple leather of a new GV70 shifted uncomfortably. They had come for an evening of fantasy and aspiration, not to witness a public humiliation. The husband muttered to his wife, "This is just awful." But Marcus was on a roll, oblivious, or perhaps reveling in the discomfort he was causing. Evelyn reached for her tablet, her fingers gliding across the screen with a slow, deliberate precision. A soft blue light illuminated her face, reflecting in her calm, dark eyes. Numbers, charts, and contract details, invisible to the rest of the room, glowed on the screen, but they were burned into her mind. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look hurt. She looked like a chess master who had already seen the checkmate, 10 moves ahead, and was simply waiting for her opponent to stumble into the trap. Her unnerving calm seemed to finally get under Marcus's skin. He had expected outrage, tears, a pleading protest. Instead, he was met with a wall of serene composure that he couldn't dent. His smirk wavered for a fraction of a second before he snapped at his underlings. "Greg, Tiffany, escort this woman to the exit. We have real business to attend to." But the order hung in the air, unanswered. Because something was happening. Phones were emerging from pockets and purses. The teenager in the corner now had his camera aimed directly at the confrontation. The woman in the navy coat whispered to her husband, "I can't just stand here. I'm recording this." The showroom was still immaculate, the cars still gleaming, but the atmosphere had curdled. It was no longer about horsepower and leather interiors. It was about dignity. And in that silent, brutal battle, the woman in the burnt orange dress was already winning. Marcus's command didn't just hang in the air. It solidified, turning into a tangible thing that his 2 top salespeople now had to deal with. Greg, the one with the slicked back hair and the smile that was all teeth, decided to double down. He stepped forward, his movements exaggerated, his expensive Italian loafers clicking an arrogant rhythm on the marble floor. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a sickeningly sweet syrup of false courtesy. "As the director said, we need to keep this area clear for our valued clientele. Please, take your things and step outside." His hand gestured towards the massive glass doors, a gesture of dismissal one might use on a stray dog. Tiffany, the younger one with the razor-sharp eyeliner, chimed in with a tinkling, cruel laugh. "She probably can't even pronounce quattro turbocharged. Come on, Greg, let's not let her waste any more of the showroom's precious time." Her words were like poisoned darts, small and sharp, aimed to inflict maximum pain with minimum effort. Marcus nodded, his arms still folded, thoroughly enjoying the show. "Exactly," he boomed, his voice resonating with self-satisfaction. "We cannot allow these disruptions." He then raised his voice, a theatrical call to arms. "Security!" From a discreet side door, a uniformed security guard emerged. He was a big man, built like a retired linebacker, but his steps were slow, heavy, as if he were wading through mud. His expression was one of weary resignation, the look of a man who had been called upon to play a part in these pathetic power plays far too many times. The guests turned in unison, their attention now fully captured. The gentle jazz music that had been a soothing backdrop now seemed jarring, completely out of place in the charged atmosphere. The scene was set, the players in their positions. But Evelyn Reed did not move. Her tablet remained on the counter, her hand resting on its cool surface. She lifted her gaze, not to the approaching guard, but past him, to the director, her expression a blank canvas on which he could project all his fears and prejudices. There was no fear in her eyes, no apology, just the unwavering stare of someone who was measuring the seconds until the inevitable reckoning. The guard, whose name tag read Frank, hesitated. He was halfway across the floor when he slowed his pace. He had been trained to handle disturbances, shouting, arguments, even physical altercations. This was none of those things. This was quiet. Too quiet. He saw a woman standing with more dignity and power than the man who was screaming at her. His eyes flickered towards Marcus, a silent request for confirmation. Marcus, enraged by this momentary hesitation, barked, "Frank, what are you waiting for? Remove her, now!" It was at that moment that Sarah, the young assistant, finally found her voice. She shot up from her chair, her movement so sudden it made a few people jump. Her voice trembled, but it was clear, and it cut through the tension like a searchlight. "Sir," she said, her eyes fixed on Marcus. She asked about the fleet package. "That's not a random question. It's a corporate account inquiry. I saw the appointment in the system." Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His composure, already cracking, shattered. He spun towards her, his face a blotchy, furious red. "You!" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You stay the hell out of this if you want to have a job tomorrow." The threat was raw, brutal, and it worked. Sarah flinched as if he had struck her, and sank back into her chair, silenced for the moment, but the truth she had spoken was now out, a living thing in the room. Across the showroom, a man in a sharp gray blazer, who had been watching with growing disgust, raised his phone higher. "I'm live streaming this, by the way," he announced, his voice calm and steady. The effect was instantaneous. A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. Eyes darted between the director, the assistant, and the woman at the center of it all. Some shook their heads in disbelief, some looked away in shame, but many more moved in closer, their own phones now raised, sensing that this was more than just a confrontation. This was a moment of consequence. Greg, the salesman, still clinging to his role as the enforcer, stepped closer to Evelyn, his personal space invasion a deliberate act of intimidation. "Don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Just turn around and walk out." Quietly. He was so confident, so sure of the outcome, so certain of his place in the hierarchy. But Evelyn did not yield. She shifted her weight slightly, a subtle, grounding movement, as if she were drawing strength from the very marble beneath her feet. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet, almost clinical pity. And that silence, that look, it hit him harder than any shouted insult could have. For the first time, his smug smirk faltered. Marcus, feeling the control of the room slipping through his fingers like sand, slammed his hand down on the granite counter. The sound echoed through the showroom like a gunshot. "This is a place of business, a temple of luxury," he roared, his voice now shrill with desperation. "We will not be intimidated by con artists and grifters playing dress-up. Get her out of my sight." His words rang through the space, each one a nail in his own coffin. The phones rose higher. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. What had started as a private, cruel dismissal had now become a full-blown public spectacle. And yet, through it all, Evelyn Reed stood unbroken, her silence speaking volumes, her composure an unbreachable fortress. Frank, the security guard, his shadow stretching long and ominous across the polished floor, took another heavy step forward. He was now just a few feet from her. But Evelyn remained as still as a statue, as if her feet were fused to the stone beneath her. Every insult Marcus had hurled had been a loud, ugly noise, but her silence was a deafening roar. It wrapped itself around the room, suffocating the last vestiges of the director's authority, forcing even those who had initially laughed to fall into a tense, watchful quiet. She didn't flinch when Frank reached the edge of the counter. She didn't turn when Greg, the salesman, repeated his command for her to leave, though his voice now lacked its earlier conviction. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath and placed her hand flat on the tablet. The screen's faint blue glow illuminated her palm, but she made no move to activate it. This wasn't hesitation. This was control. This was theater. Marcus, in his arrogance, completely misread the moment. He leaned across the counter, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Nothing left to say? That's what I thought." His words were like stones tossed into a perfectly still pond, but the ripples they created dissipated long before they could reach her. She finally looked at him, directly into his eyes, and her gaze was so calm, so steady, it was unnerving. Her tone was even, almost conversational. "Are you absolutely certain this is the path you want to take, Marcus?" The question wasn't a threat. It was a final off-ramp, a last chance for him to step back from the cliff's edge. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'm certain of one thing. This showroom is not for you. It never will be. Frank, finish this. Now." Frank shifted uneasily. He was a professional, trained to de-escalate, to handle disruptions with a firm but fair hand. But this felt wrong. He glanced at the sea of guests, at the dozens of phones held aloft like torches, and at Sarah, the young assistant, who was now staring at him with pleading eyes. Something in the air, a palpable sense of impending doom, warned him that this was no ordinary removal. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, to expand, until it pressed against the very walls of the showroom. This wasn't weakness. This was the pregnant pause before a judge delivers a verdict. Memories, unbidden and sharp, flickered through her mind. She was 24, standing in a bank lobby, clutching her first major commission check, the seed money for what would become her empire. The teller, a prim woman with a tight bun and even tighter lips, had looked at the check, then at her, then back at the check. "We'll need a manager to verify this," she had said, her tone implying that the check, and by extension Evelyn herself, was a forgery. Evelyn had been forced to wait for 2 excruciating hours, watching as white men in suits were served in minutes, their checks never questioned. That humiliation hadn't broken her. It had forged her. It had carved itself into her DNA, into her resolve. She had vowed in that moment that she would never again let someone else's prejudice define her reality. Never again would her silence be mistaken for surrender. Now, years later, that same silence was her sharpest weapon, honed by 1,000 sleights, wielded with a surgeon's precision. She let it hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket, forcing every person in that room to confront the ugliness of the moment, to feel the weight of their own complicity. Sarah, the young assistant, couldn't take it anymore. She rose from her chair again, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. Her voice, though it cracked with emotion, was clear and strong. Her request was valid, she stated, looking not at Marcus but at the crowd. She asked for the fleet package. I saw the appointment entry this morning. The name was Evelyn Reed. The room stiffened. The truth, now given a name, was a dangerous, undeniable thing. Marcus's head snapped towards Sarah, his face a mask of pure fury. One more word out of you, and I'll see to it you never work in this city again, he snarled. But the damage was done. The guests were whispering more openly now. The man in the gray blazer, still live streaming, spoke softly into his phone's microphone. They're trying to push out a legitimate corporate buyer. This is going to backfire on them big time. And through it all, Evelyn Reed didn't move. Her stillness was not defeat. It was power contained, a coiled spring waiting for the precise moment to release. She stood as if the very floor of the showroom answered to her, her silence echoing louder and louder, drowning out every insult, every threat. And with every second that ticked by, the balance of power in the room shifted, inch by painful inch, in her direction. The room was no longer just a showroom. It had become a courtroom, and every guest, every employee, every person watching online had become the jury. Marcus Thorne still believed he was the judge, but his authority was slipping away with every silent, damning second that passed. Near the back, the teenager, whose name was Leo, steadied his phone, his thumb swiping through the rapidly scrolling comments on his live stream. He whispered into the mic, "This is happening right now, live from the Genesis showroom in downtown Chicago. The director just told her she can't afford to even touch the cars. Now he's trying to have her thrown out." The viewer count was skyrocketing. Messages were flooding in from all over the world. People who had never set foot in a luxury showroom were now invested witnesses to this raw, unfolding drama. The woman in the navy coat, her name was Eleanor, angled her phone to get a clear shot of Frank the guard's face, capturing his profound hesitation. "I cannot believe the audacity," she murmured to her husband, who replied softly, "Keep recording, honey. The world needs to see this." Their voices were low, but they were filled with the kind of quiet conviction that starts revolutions. Behind the desk, Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. She had spoken up once and been brutally silenced, but the truth was a fire in her chest that refused to be extinguished. Her eyes darted to Evelyn, who met her gaze for a brief, fleeting moment. In that single, wordless exchange, there was a universe of understanding, a recognition of courage, a shared sense of dignity that refused to be trampled. Marcus, feeling the tide turning against him, slammed his hand on the counter again, louder this time, a desperate attempt to regain control through sheer volume. "Enough!" he bellowed. "Frank, get her out of here before this turns into a complete circus!" His voice echoed, but the certainty was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle edge of panic. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the pressure of the whispers, the silent, collective judgment he could not control. Evelyn finally made a move. She adjusted the strap of her satchel on her shoulder, a small, deliberate, unhurried gesture. Her eyes swept the room, not landing on Marcus, but on the witnesses, the jury, who now stood taller, their phones raised like lanterns in a dark, cavernous hall. She didn't speak, but in that single sweeping glance, she gave them permission. She invited them to be more than just spectators. She invited them to stand with her. And they did. The man in the gray blazer spoke, his voice ringing with authority. "Sir, I'd think very carefully before you lay a hand on that woman. I have a strong suspicion she's a corporate buyer." His words, sharp and clear, cut through the air, shifting the balance of power decisively. Murmurs rippled across the room, growing louder. A man in a perfectly tailored suit who had been silent until now shook his head and said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is textbook discrimination. It's disgusting." Another guest whispered to her friend, "I was going to buy a G80 today. Not anymore. I'll never set foot in this place again." Marcus's jaw tightened. The murmuring was becoming a roar. The tide of public opinion was a tsunami, and he was standing on the beach. Sarah could not hold back any longer. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Her name is Evelyn Reed," she declared, her voice trembling but carrying across the marble like a trumpet blast. "I saw the file. It's a fleet package evaluation. $6 billion. She's not lying." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Phones shifted, zooming in on Sarah's face, then on Marcus's. Capturing his reaction, Leo's live stream went berserk. "$6 billion? Did she just say $6 billion?" the comment screamed. Marcus's face went from red to a sickly pale white. But he was in too deep to back down now. He forced a sneer. "Don't believe a word of it. It's a trick, a scam. People like her are always trying to cheat the system." That phrase, "people like her," landed with the force of a physical blow. A distinguished, gray-haired man standing near the champagne table muttered, "I cannot believe he just said that out loud." Another guest turned to her friend's camera, shaking her head in disgust. "This is exactly why we need to record things like this, so they can't deny it later." And through it all, Evelyn Reed remained still, her silence pressing down harder with every witness who spoke up. Marcus thought he was reasserting control, but in reality, every word he uttered was just another twist of the noose, tightening around his own neck. The witnesses were no longer passive observers. They were participants, and their phones were rewriting the script he thought he controlled. Frank the guard lowered his hands completely, a look of dawning horror on his face. Marcus, furious at this blatant insubordination, snapped at him, "Do your damn job!" But Frank hesitated, his eyes wide as he looked at the glowing screens, at the crowd that no longer felt like a collection of wealthy customers, but like a jury, and at the woman in the burnt orange dress. Evelyn finally lifted her hand from her satchel, not to grab her tablet, but to rest it calmly at her side. Her silence had held the room captive long enough. It was time to shift from patience to precision. The witnesses had spoken, the cameras were rolling, and the next move would not belong to Marcus Thorne. It would belong to her. Marcus's face, now a mottled canvas of red and white, contorted with a rage born of pure panic. He could feel the eyes on him. Dozens of them, cold and judging, magnified by the unblinking lenses of the phones that were now all pointed in his direction. Instead of retreating, he plunged forward, sharpening his cruelty into a weapon. He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the counter, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You are wasting my showroom's time. People like you are not clients. You are frauds who think a pretty dress and a sob story can fool us." Gasps rippled through the showroom. The words weren't just an insult. They were a slanderous accusation. A couple standing near a sleek, silver G80 exchanged horrified looks. The woman whispered, "Did he just call her a fraud?" Her husband nodded grimly, his phone held high and steady. Greg, the salesman, ever the loyal lapdog, jumped in eagerly. "Exactly, boss. I've seen her type before. Walks in with nothing, claims to have everything, tries to play the victim. It's pathetic." He smirked, but the smirk didn't reach his eyes, which were darting nervously around the room. The word pathetic didn't land as he'd intended. A woman in the crowd muttered, "The only thing pathetic here is how you're treating her." Tiffany, the one with the eyeliner sharp as a blade, folded her arms and added with a disdainful sniff, "If she really had $6 billion, she wouldn't be standing here all by herself. She'd have a team of lawyers, an army of assistants, a briefcase full of contracts." Her laugh was brittle, a sound like breaking glass. Marcus straightened up, spreading his hands wide in a dramatic gesture, as if he were a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Look around you," he boomed. "Does anyone here seriously believe this nonsense? A corporate fleet contract of that magnitude? With her? I think not. This is a scam, and we do not tolerate scams under this roof." Every word he hurled was designed to strip her of her dignity, to paint her as an imposter, to invalidate her very presence. But the more he spoke, the more the tide of opinion turned against him. The guests were whispering openly now, their voices overlapping in a chorus of disapproval. A man near the entrance said loudly, "This is beyond discrimination. He's accusing her of a crime." Another replied, "He's going to regret this. It's all on video." Evelyn finally moved, but not in the way they expected. She reached into her satchel, and with a smooth, unhurried motion she retrieved her tablet. She laid it flat on the counter, her fingertips resting gently on its edge. Her expression was unchanged. Her eyes were calm, her posture unshaken. She didn't meet insult with insult. She didn't defend herself against their lies. Instead, she let the weight of her silence hang in the air once more, forcing Marcus's own ugly words to echo back at him. Sarah, the young assistant, couldn't stay seated a moment longer. She rose once more, her voice stronger this time, ringing with conviction. "I saw her name in the system. Evelyn Reed, Carter Global Logistics, Fleet Package Evaluation, Executive Clearance." Each piece of information was a hammer blow to Marcus's credibility. The guests turned their cameras toward Sarah, some nodding in encouragement, others whispering, "She's telling the truth." Marcus snapped, his fury finally breaking through the last dam of his composure. "You are finished here," he screamed at Sarah. "You will be unemployed by sunset. Do you hear me? Unemployed for lying for this nobody." The room reacted instantly. Several guests murmured their disgust. The older man near the champagne table said firmly, "That's witness intimidation. This is completely unacceptable." Still, Marcus pressed on, his desperation making him reckless. He pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn. "You will not get a car. You will not get a cup of coffee. You will not even be allowed to breathe the air in this showroom again. You are done. Get out." His finger jabbed the air toward the glass doors, his voice rising to a near hysterical shout. Yet, in the midst of this chaotic, ugly tirade, Evelyn stood still, poised, dignified. The burnt orange dress seemed to glow under the chandelier's light, a quiet flame against the cold, hard marble. Her silence spoke louder than any of his rants. It wasn't weakness. It was a warning. And in that moment, the guests who had once watched in confusion, then in disgust, began to see the truth. Marcus Thorne hadn't humiliated Evelyn Reed. He was in the process of immolating himself. The director's anger finally boiled over, spilling past the point of no return. His hand shot across the counter, snatching the glossy G90 brochure that lay near Evelyn's tablet. The heavy paper crumpled in his fist before he flung it contemptuously to the floor, a gesture of pure, childish rage. A collective gasp went through the room, a sharp, unified sound against the tense silence. "You think you can just walk into my showroom and lie your way into a multi-billion-dollar contract?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "Not today. Not in my house." His declaration wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a desperate attempt to physically erase her, to defile her presence, to strip away her dignity by force. Greg, the salesman, emboldened by his boss's meltdown, smirked. "She should be grateful we're even talking to her," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Most places would have called the cops on her an hour ago." His words hung in the air like a threat. The younger associate, Tiffany, nodded in vicious agreement. Marcus seized on the suggestion like a drowning man clutching at a snake, He slammed his palm down on the granite counter, the sound cracking through the showroom like a gavel of injustice. "Security, call the police. Tell them we have a trespasser, a fraudulent individual attempting to access restricted corporate contracts. Tell them she's refusing to leave." Frank, the security guard, froze. His hand hovered over the radio on his belt, but it stayed there, unmoving. He looked from Marcus's contorted, furious face to Evelyn's serene, composed one, then to the sea of guests, their phones held high like silent accusers. His eyes betrayed his inner turmoil, the dawning realization of a man who knew this situation was spiraling far beyond his control, and that he was on the wrong side of it. Evelyn did not move. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her satchel with a deliberate, maddening calm. Her silence was now louder, more powerful than Marcus's unhinged shouting. To anyone watching closely, her composure wasn't passivity. It was preparation. Eleanor, the woman with the gray hair tied back in a neat bun, spoke out, her voice trembling with righteous outrage, but loud enough for all to hear. "She hasn't done a single thing wrong. This is harassment." Her phone remained fixed on the scene, an unblinking witness. Marcus whirled on her, his anger now wild and unfocused. "Mind your own damn business," he snapped, his authority bleeding away into pure desperation. "This is not your concern." But it was too late. The showroom was no longer his stage. The guests were no longer a passive audience. They were speaking out, murmuring, recording, becoming part of the story. The narrative he had tried so desperately to control was slipping further and further from his grasp with every raised phone, with every whispered protest. Sarah, the young assistant, stepped forward again, her voice breaking through the tension like a clear bell. "Her name is in the system. You know it is, Marcus. I saw it myself this morning. This is wrong, and you know it." Her words were not just defiance anymore. They were an indictment, public, direct, and undeniable. Marcus's response was to lash out even harder. He jabbed a finger at her, his voice a guttural roar. "You're finished! Out! Both of you, out!" He grabbed a random stack of promotional flyers from the counter and, in a fit of pique, flung them towards the floor near Evelyn's feet, as if the mess he was creating could somehow obscure the truth. The phones captured every second. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their unease solidifying into open disapproval. The man in the tailored suit said firmly, "You are going to regret this. This is all on video." Marcus's chest heaved with fury, but in the midst of his rage, Evelyn Reed stood unmoved. The chandelier light caught the curve of her cheek. Her posture was steady, her silence impenetrable. She had endured the insults, the accusations, the public humiliation, and now the threat of arrest. Yet she did not falter. What Marcus, in his blind arrogance, failed to understand was that every cruel gesture, every shouted order, was not building his authority, but cementing his downfall. And as the witnesses grew bolder, as the cameras multiplied, his own power shrank beneath the crushing weight of his prejudice. The storm he thought he was directing was about to turn on him. And when it did, it would not be her he had to weather. It would be his own. The air inside the showroom was thick, heavy, charged with an attention so focused it felt like a physical weight. Marcus's shouting still echoed off the marble walls, but the echoes were hollow, devoid of authority. They were just the desperate noise of a man losing control. The brochures and flyers scattered on the floor were not just paper. They were the confetti of his professional suicide. Then Evelyn moved, with a calm, deliberate grace that was in stark contrast to the director's flailing rage. She lifted her tablet from the counter. She tapped the screen once, a single decisive motion. The blue glow illuminated her face, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she spoke more than a single question. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear, so steady, so full of quiet power that it cut through every other sound in the room. Activate Protocol Omega-6. The words were cryptic, but they struck the room like a thunderclap. A moment later, a soft, electronic chime emanated from the tablet, followed by the crisp, disembodied voice of a woman speaking through its speakers. Protocol Omega-6 confirmed. Are you sure you wish to proceed, Ms. Reed? This will trigger the immediate withdrawal of all contracts under the Carter Global Logistics portfolio, valued at $6.2 billion. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, sucked the oxygen from the room. The guests looked from one another to Marcus, whose face had gone from pale to a ghastly, bloodless white. Frank, the guard, froze mid-step, his hands suspended in the air. Greg and Tiffany, the salespeople, glanced at their boss, their smug expressions completely gone, replaced by dawning horror. Evelyn Reed did not hesitate. Her voice was as cold and hard as a diamond. Proceed. Another chime sounded from the tablet, a sound of finality, a sound of doom. Sarah, the young assistant, covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She knew. She had seen the file. She knew what those words meant. Marcus may not have believed it, but she knew that Carter Global Logistics wasn't just another account. It was the lifeblood of their entire dealership network, the revenue stream that kept the lights on, the very foundation of their success. Marcus sputtered, his anger now hopelessly tangled with a rising tide of panic. You can't do that! You don't have that kind of authority." His voice cracked, the arrogant certainty shattered into a million pieces. He leaned over the counter, as if by getting closer he could somehow reverse the irreversible command that had just been given. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes as calm as a frozen lake. "I had that authority the moment I walked through your doors, Marcus. You just failed to recognize it." The words landed not as an explanation, but as a verdict. The guests murmured louder now, their disbelief morphing into stunned admiration. Leo, the teenager, whispered into his phone, his voice shaking with excitement. "She just canceled $6 billion, live. He is so finished." His live stream comments exploded into a waterfall of text. "OMG, boss move! This is history. Justice is a woman in a burnt orange dress." Sarah, tears of vindication now streaming down her face, whispered, "It's real. She just pulled every single contract. He has no idea what he's just done." Marcus, in a last desperate act, lunged for the tablet, but Evelyn pulled it back with an effortless, graceful motion. He slammed his hand on the counter again, but the sound was pathetic now, lost in the new, heavy silence of the room. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Evelyn Reed stood taller now, her posture radiating a quiet, commanding energy. "You told me I couldn't afford to touch these cars," she said, her voice even and clear. "What you failed to understand is that my company had already paid for nearly half the vehicles in this entire network, and now they're gone." A new silence fell over the room. But this was not the tense, uncertain silence of before. This was the stunned, absolute silence of revelation. Frank the guard took a deliberate step backward. Greg and Tiffany stared at the floor, at their shoes, at anything but the woman who held their fate in her hands. The guests whispered openly, their voices a mixture of outrage at Marcus and awe for Evelyn. Marcus's hands trembled as he pointed a shaky finger at her. "You can't destroy me like this," he whimpered. "You just can't." His words were frantic, almost a plea. She looked at him one final time, her eyes steady, her voice firm. "Dignity is not for sale, Marcus, but arrogance can cost you everything." And with that, the countdown to his utter ruin had reached zero. Marcus's face was a pale, slack mask of disbelief. The numbers were too big, the consequences too absolute to deny. He scanned the room, desperately searching for an ally, for someone to validate his shattered reality, but he found no one. Greg and Tiffany wouldn't meet his gaze. Frank the guard had taken another step back, effectively disassociating himself from the entire situation. The guests, his prized clientele, held their phones higher, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt, recording every tremor in his voice, every flicker of fear in his eyes. Evelyn closed the tablet with a soft, final click and slipped it back into her satchel. She lifted her chin slightly, her presence commanding the room without a single raised word. "I am not here to browse," she said, her voice calm, clear, and carrying to every corner of the showroom. "I am not here to play dress-up. I am Evelyn Reed, the Chief Executive Officer of Carter Global Logistics. My company operates the largest and most valuable corporate fleet in the United States. And for the past 5 years, this dealership network has supplied nearly half of our vehicles." The declaration struck the room like a bolt of lightning. The murmurs exploded into gasps, the gasps into a wave of shocked understanding that quickly transformed into absolute certainty. Sarah, the assistant, nodded vigorously, tears of relief and vindication streaming down her face as she whispered, "I knew it. I knew it." Leo, the teenager, practically shouted into his phone, "She's the CEO! She's the damn CEO! She owns the contracts! It's real!" Marcus staggered back a step, his mouth hanging open, but no words came out. The arrogance that had been his armor, his weapon, his entire identity, drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. He looked at her now, not as a nuisance, not as a fraud, but as the executioner of his professional life. Evelyn took a single, deliberate step closer to the counter, her heels clicking with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You thought my silence meant weakness," she said, her voice low and steady. "It never did. It meant I was giving you an opportunity to be decent, an opportunity to do your job. It meant patience. And today, my patience has ended." The phones captured her every word, every nuance of her powerful, controlled delivery. The guests watched with wide-eyed fascination, some smiling, some shaking their heads in sheer awe. The truth was no longer a secret whispered in the corners. It was standing before them, magnificent and undeniable, in a burnt orange dress. Marcus Thorne had wanted to erase her. Instead, she had just erased him from the equation. The words hung in the air, undeniable, irrefutable, and devastatingly heavy. Chief Executive Officer, Carter Global Logistics, $6.2 billion. The showroom, which only moments ago had been Marcus's kingdom, was now the stage for his public execution, and every single person in it was a witness. Sarah, the young assistant at the corner desk, clutched her chest, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaping her lips. She whispered to no one in particular, her voice thick with emotion. "She's really the CEO. She owns them. She owns everything they depend on." Greg, the salesman with the slicked back hair, felt his smug smirk crumble into a mask of pure terror. He took a clumsy step backward, as if putting physical distance between himself and Evelyn could somehow erase the venom he had so gleefully spewed just minutes before. Tiffany's perfectly painted smile had collapsed entirely. Her arms were wrapped tightly across her chest, a futile attempt to shield herself from the judgment that was now raining down upon them. Neither of them dared to meet Evelyn's gaze. Frank, the security guard who had been ordered to physically remove her, now lowered his eyes and shifted his stance into one of respectful deference. He knew there would be no arrest, no removal. If anything, he was terrified that by simply standing too close to Marcus, He had placed himself on the wrong side of history. The guests' whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chorus of shock and awe. She owns the entire fleet. He insulted his biggest client, the CEO. $6 billion gone. Just like that. The phones tilted back and forth, from Evelyn's calm, powerful face to Marcus's unraveling one, capturing his complete and utter disintegration in real time. Marcus himself stood at the counter, his trembling hands clutching the edge as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The arrogance, the sneering superiority that had dripped from every word he spoke, was gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant look of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was a king without a kingdom, a voice without a sound. Evelyn didn't need to speak another word. Her silence, once a weapon of patience, was now a crushing weight, pressing down on him like a verdict already delivered. In that silence, the witnesses judged him. In that silence, his empire crumbled. And in that silence, he finally, truly understood. The humiliation he had tried so cruelly to inflict upon her had come full circle, magnified 1,000 times over, and now it was his and his alone to bear. Evelyn Reed took another step forward, her heels striking the marble floor with the rhythmic, inexorable toll of a clock nearing its final hour. She retrieved her tablet from her satchel once more, her movements fluid and precise. She spoke with a calm, chilling finality. Carter Global Logistics is hereby terminating all contracts, agreements, and partnerships with this dealership and all of its national affiliates. Effective immediately, all $6.2 billion in pending and future orders are withdrawn. Furthermore, your access to our corporate procurement and logistics systems is permanently revoked. A final, crisp confirmation tone chimed from her device. It was an unyielding digital exclamation point on his professional death sentence. The sound seemed to echo through the entire showroom, louder than his shouts, louder than the whispers, louder than the frantic beating of his own heart. Sarah gasped, fresh tears streaking her face as she whispered, "It's done. He just lost everything. The entire network." The guests murmured in disbelief. "$6 billion gone," one man repeated, his voice full of awe. "Just like that," another added, shaking his head. "This entire company is finished." Marcus's legs seemed to buckle. He gripped the counter, his knuckles white, as if it could anchor him in the storm that was now consuming him. But it couldn't. The foundation of his arrogance had been pulverized. His empire had been severed, cauterized, and discarded with a single sentence, a single command. He shook his head, his voice a pathetic, cracking fragment of what it once was. You can't do this." Her gaze met his, steady, cool, and unflinching. "I just did." The guests erupted in hushed exclamations, their cameras capturing every word, every nuance of this historic moment. The livestream comments scrolled faster than anyone could possibly read, a digital flood of cheers, of outrage, of pure, unadulterated vindication. Across the city, across the country, across the world, the truth was spreading like wildfire. Frank the guard had retreated almost to the wall, his eyes lowered in a silent, profound respect. Greg and Tiffany stood frozen, their faces drained of all color, statues in a museum of their own failure. Marcus alone remained trapped in the spotlight, clutching at the last, frayed threads of his authority. But every single thread had already snapped. Evelyn closed her tablet and slipped it back into her bag. Her voice carried one last order, not to Marcus, but to the disembodied voice on her tablet, an order that was cold, absolute, and utterly devastating. Scrub them from the system, permanently, and with that, his downfall was sealed, signed, and delivered. The showroom had fallen into a silence so deep, so profound, that the soft, ambient hum of the showroom lights seemed deafening. Marcus Thorne, who had once stood so tall, so filled with a cheap, unearned arrogance, now sagged against the counter, his empire, his career, his very sense of self, erased by the very woman he had tried so contemptuously to dismiss. The guests no longer looked at him. Their eyes and their cameras were all on her, on Evelyn Reed, the woman in the burnt orange dress who stood with the calm, unwavering presence of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to command the world's respect. She turned towards the massive glass doors, her heels striking steady, rhythmic notes across the polished marble. The crowd of witnesses parted for her instinctively, not out of fear, but out of a deep and sudden reverence. The phones followed her every step, capturing not just the epic collapse of one man's ego, but the triumphant rise of a truth too long ignored. At the threshold of the showroom, she paused. She didn't turn around, but her voice carried back into the space, low, deliberate, and unforgettable. "Money can never buy you dignity," she said, her words hanging in the air like scripture. "But a lack of dignity, once it's put on display for the world to see, can strip an empire to dust." The guests nodded, some whispering their agreement, others simply staring in awe. At her desk, Sarah wiped her tears and whispered. She turned silence into a superpower. Leo, the teenager, his live stream still rolling, said to his thousands of viewers, his voice thick with emotion, "This is what justice looks like. You're watching it happen. Right now." Marcus sank lower, his hands shaking, his professional empire already beginning to unravel far beyond the walls of this glass and marble tomb. The live streams, the recordings, the witnesses would ensure that his humiliation would reach every corner of the corporate world, while her presence, her restraint, and her final, powerful words would echo for far longer. Evelyn Reed stepped through the glass doors and out into the cool night air, the burnt orange of her dress catching the city lights. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The verdict was in. The sentence had been carried out. And in the profound silence that followed her exit, every single witness in that room understood a fundamental truth. True power never needs to shout. It simply stands, unshaken, and waits for arrogance to destroy itself. What you've just witnessed is more than a story. It's a testament to the power of quiet strength and the high cost of prejudice. Have you ever seen anything like this? Have you ever had to stand your ground in the face of such blatant disrespect? Share your story, your thoughts, your reactions in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if this story moved you, if it made you stand up and cheer, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories like this to share. Stories of justice, of vindication, and of the incredible power of the human spirit. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.